Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of Talking Tech, Women and Girls in ICT. My name is Lena Obaid. I'm a recent graduate of Aerospace Engineering from Khalifa University, and today I'm delighted to be promoting women and girls in ICT. I'm excited to be having a discussion about tech and tech careers with Jennifer Manor, Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at EchoStar Corporation and Hughes Network Systems. She's also a film producer and an author. So Talking Tech is a series celebrating girls and women in tech, being recorded around the world between Girls in ICT Day 2020 and Girls in ICT Day 2022. Girls in ICT Day is an international day marked on the fourth Thursday of each April. In 2021, Girls in ICT Day was held on the 22nd of April. The objectives of Girls in ICT Day are to help create a global environment that empowers and encourages girls and young women to consider studies and careers in the growing field of communication and information technologies. So the Talking Tech series is brought to you by the ITU, UNICC, and the Office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, and is in support of Equals, the global partnership for gender equality in the digital age. And I'm very pleased to be a part of this session today. The goals of the series include to interest and inspire girls and younger women with information about a range of ICT careers that can be had, and bring before a broader audience some of the role model women in tech and share information about their career journeys and work. This series also tries to offer diverse examples of how ICT is being used to support achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals and other United Nations goals. We also try to showcase initiatives that are working with girls to support them in ICT studies or future ICT careers, and provide girls and young women in tech with a leadership opportunity to represent and promote girls in tech organizations with which they are involved, and to promote it to a broader international audience. As an aerospace engineer, a more gender-balanced tech sector is something that I'm passionate about and working towards. So I'm delighted to now shift to a conversation with Jennifer Manor, Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at EchoStar and Hughes Network Systems. Jennifer, it's great to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
So I would like to start off with asking you about your career in tech. How did you start with your career in technology? And what was your early career like?
Thank you for the question. It's not the clearest path, which I think is interesting. So unlike you, I went to college, I was going to be a great actress. I went to college for theater arts. And it turns out I quickly learned that I didn't have as much talent as I thought. And I had always had an interest in political science. So I ended up with a double major in political science, and very much focused on the international side, which has always been a driving interest of me, which still doesn't get me to tech. So I had decided that after college, I would go to law school, because if I was going to be an actress, I would have been waitressing tables. And that's not what I wanted for my career goal. And while in law school, I took two courses that I really think led me down this path. One course was a communications law course, which I really, really enjoyed. And at that time, I went to law school in the late 80s, and a lot of this was still focused on broadcast and so forth. And since I had a theater background, kind of the idea of, television, media, it was very exciting. But we did touch a little bit on telephones and other technologies, but that led the basis for me being interested in that. But probably more importantly, I took a class in admiralty law. And what I really enjoyed about admiralty, and I took 2 semesters of this, was the concept of sharing scarce resources. I also took some international law courses at the same time with treaties, and it really set me down the path that I found how do you all operate in whatever sort of environment you are together incredibly interesting. So after law school, I actually went on for a postgraduate degree, a master's of law in international, and it was there I was able to pursue further my interest in these areas. I took courses like space law, international communications, treaty negotiations, ironically an arms control class, which has many of the same sorts of characteristics of the treaty negotiations, and really got interested in my first articles that I got published were on Airbus at that point, so with aeronautical and the satellite. And that led me to my first job at the Federal Communications Commission. And I'll never forget, since I had a degree in international, I thought I would end up in the international group at that point. And I actually wasn't. I was sent to, it was certainly after we actually introduced competition in the United States in the phone industry. And we still had a very limited market on local telephone. So I got sent to this group called Accounting and Audits. And one of the things I found most interesting, though, was trying to figure out what different pieces of the network equipment were. So we'd be talking about, a PBX, and is that this big or is that big? And I was intrigued. And I remember talking to my boss, who was a woman, and this was 1992. So there still weren't as many women as there are today in the field. And I was very concerned because it wasn't only 6 months, I should know everything, 2 months or whatever it was. And she says to me, she was, Jennifer, in another few months, you'll know as much as any other, any man in the industry. And I'll never forget that. And it was true. And one of the things I think is great about technology and great for new entrants and for women in particular and others is that the technology changes so fast that age doesn't really help you in this area because you have to stay up on the technology. And so I got hooked pretty quickly, and then the rest has been my career. So even though I didn't even start out doing exactly what I wanted to do, I ultimately was able to get there. I had a wonderful first boss who was incredibly supportive and enabled me to move on to the areas that I was really interested in. But the idea of technology and how that could really change people's lives was something I saw very early in my career.
That's so fascinating. When people think maybe about the tech industry, there's the misconception that you have to be an engineer or you have to be a scientist or you have to have those specific technical skills, but there's really space in the tech industry for people of all backgrounds, whether that's the humanities, law, policy. And you make it sound like it's great to be a young person in tech right now. That's great to hear.
Yeah, maybe I could just build on that for a second. So I think, if you were to say, well, if I was to do it over again, I probably would have gone for an engineering degree. I don't know that I would have gotten my degree. That's a different issue. But I do think having that technology basis. But the other thing that I think is so fantastic about communications, I mean, I'm in the space side, but I've been on different parts. I've worked on wireless, I've worked on wireline, is that you get to work with so many interesting people. So my team at my company today is I have engineers who work for me and with me. And so much I'm so reliant on them, just like they're reliant on me for certain issues where they're the experts in getting to understand things and be able to sit down with people. And when I was with the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, our regulator, where I had the opportunity to serve 3 times, I enjoyed nothing more than sitting around sometimes and just asking someone to explain this to me. And so I may not have as deep an understanding, but understanding the issues. And then, part of my job is translating them into common language so people can understand and create rules and other things. But I think it's so interesting. And I think the interdisciplinary nature of communications is fantastic. So no one should be afraid of anything. It takes you a little while to learn the terminology, but I think that's true. If you work in a manufacturing business, it makes stresses. I'm sure there's a whole other, terms. It's not being afraid, but also not being afraid to ask questions when you don't know the answer.
I like that you mentioned the interdisciplinary nature of communications because from what I've heard of your career, in your position, you are kind of in the middle of a bunch of different disciplines. So it's an interdisciplinary industry and your role is also very interdisciplinary, which seems like it can be challenging at times. Are there any challenges that you face in your career that you would like to share that you maybe learned a lesson from, whether it is early in your career or sort of as you progressed within your career?
I think probably one of the things I would say is nothing is as bad as you think it is, and you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. And, not doing something because you're fearful that you're going to make a mistake probably will hurt your career more than making the mistake and learning from it. A friend of mine tells a story about what her husband said to her years ago. There was a big Telecommunications Act passed in the US. And she was working very, very hard on implementing rules and meeting the timeframes. And she was just very stressed. And one day, she didn't feel like she was doing her job. And her husband, and this is back in the day when we had more people had landline phones, picks up the phone and says, the woman's name, you have a dial tone today. You've done your job, and put the phone back down. And I think that kind of sums it up. But in terms of mistakes, maybe I'll talk about where I probably went wrong. And this was something where I changed roles. And I've been at a company as a VP in a satellite company, now known as Legato. And I wasn't progressing as fast as I'd like from a career perspective. And I took a job that I probably shouldn't have with a bigger title. And it wasn't so much the paycheck, it was that I felt I would have more responsibility and I had earned this. And I went in and I didn't really think about the position and whether I really fit into it and whether it was something I really wanted to do. And when I got there, it was just, I was miserable from day one. It was a mistake. And I'd say within a month or so, I actually left that job and I was devastated. I didn't know what I was going to do. So I started consulting because I make money and people were very good to me. But it didn't end up in a bad place afterwards. It turns out shortly thereafter, within another month, I was back in the government in a fantastic role. I came back in as deputy chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and then moved over and became the deputy chief of the Office of Engineering and Technology at the FCC. First woman, first lawyer ever in that role. And I think I learned so much, and I learned so much by having a setback, because all during my career, I kind of did, I made the right choices. And this one time I made a terrible, you would have seen me, I was depressed. I was, woe is me, but I didn't let it get to me. I sat there and I met with people and I called people because I knew I didn't want to do consulting. And because of that, I think I ended up in a much better position. And I think in the role I had at the Federal Communications Commission at that time, where we were doing the National Broadband Plan, it was just a great time. And I really think it was one of the more productive periods in my life, where if I hadn't taken that risk, even though it wasn't a great, it took a couple of steps, I might not have had the broader opportunity, which I really value.
It's really inspiring. And it's really inspiring to me that you took a setback and you used it as your motivation to do something that you actually care about. So it sounds like the second job that you took was a bad fit for you. And I think that as young people are graduating, or maybe they're still in university or high school and trying to figure out the next steps in their life, do you have any advice on how to know if something is a good fit for you or a bad fit for you, so that you can maybe anticipate that before you're put in the situation?
I think you have to follow your gut and really pay attention to it. And I had one other job, which actually turned out to be fine, but probably was a job in retrospect, I wish I hadn't taken. I remember after I took it, my eye started, kind of fluttering. And I'll never forget that. And I'm like, is this a mistake? And it worked out okay, but there were definitely things that I must have sensed when I was going in. Similarly with this job, I wasn't quite there yet. So I think you want to be excited, but you also want to look at it for what it is. And, I go back to my first job at the Federal Communications Commission. I'll never forget, I graduated with this master's degree in international law. So I assumed I was going to the international. Then it was a division. Today it's a bureau. And I went to meet the person who was the deputy bureau chief, who was going to tell me where I was going to go. Big guy, scary. When you're 25, everyone's scary. And he's banging on the table and telling me, I'm going to send you to the best part of the FCC. And it's the place where all the money decisions are made. And I'm like, international? And he goes, at accounting and audits. And I'm sure my jaw just dropped. I hadn't taken a math class since 10th grade, probably. And, I went and I just worked like hell. And I did everything I could. And in 6 months, my boss, the woman I told you about earlier, moved me into a special project because she saw that I really cared and I was willing to work hard. And ultimately, I got exactly where I wanted. So I'd say even in a situation where it's not exactly what you think, if you do a good job and you have a good attitude, there will be opportunities. And I don't think I can think of any case of anyone I know where that hasn't been the case. But if you go in and you're moping and you're whatever, you're not working hard, you're just not going to get there. So I think everything's an opportunity and nothing is forever. Versus you go in and you go, this is just awful. And you work hard and you network and you do what you have to move on. And I'd say one of the most important things I think in my career has always been the fact, not only that I have mentors, but I have sponsors. So, I kind of have a number of folks who serve as my mentor and I talk to them about career advice. But I say the people who've mattered the most to me are what I call sponsors. And they're the people who go that extra step, help you get that job, help you get that raise. And you can't just decide, oh, I see someone on the street, they're going to be down the hall, they're going to be sponsor. It's going to be a relationship you have, but talking to those people, trying to understand how to do things, having people who will have your back. And it doesn't even have to be in the same field. For instance, the person who's probably my sponsor right now is actually on the business side. And he's just been very good to me, and really looks out for me. But at the same point, I support him on a day-to-day basis. So he knows my work and knows I'm good. So I think that's something really important too. Even if you're in a situation where you're not as happy, look for people, you want to get to know, and hopefully they'll help you and be able to give you some advice and maybe even help you get that next job.
Right, that's a really good point, to try and just talk to people and have conversations and see where those conversations get
And
you. You
I
never
think,
know.
and it's really scary when you're young because you feel like you're bothering people. And
Yeah.
I will tell you, there's almost no one you'll ask who won't have a cup of coffee with you or a quick Zoom chat now. It's probably even easier now because it doesn't even have to be in person. But most people are flattered that someone wants to take the time who's younger to talk to them too. So don't feel like you're interfering. I find it fascinating and I learn so much from those conversations as much as I think the people who I'm talking to.
Great to hear, because I think, as you said, when you're a young person reaching out to somebody older who is more accomplished or who's further on in their career, it's sort of like you're taking away from their time that they could be spending on doing something more important. So it's good to hear that even people who are further on in their career still want to help and give back. I kind of want to shift a bit and talk about some things that are outside of work. So you're a film producer and you've also written 2 books and you have a third one coming out soon. Congratulations. And I just wanted to talk about what those activities that are outside of work, how have they impacted your life, or what value do you feel that they bring to your work life and to your life outside of work?
So it's a good question. So my books, just to clarify, are all on telecom. So that's pretty easy. And in that regard, I've always liked to write, but the reason I wrote my first book was I actually had something to say, I felt. And at that point, it was in the 90s and I was very passionate. It was when we still had a lot of telecom monopolies. And I'd spent a lot of time in my career and while I was at MCI, the phone company, working on trying to break up monopolies, which I really don't believe in. But it gave me the opportunity to actually try to explain it. And my second book was on spectrum, and the current book is on spectrum. And once again, I'm actually writing a chapter right now which addresses a new view of how you have to think about spectrum management from a three-dimensional perspective. And part of what I really like about this is it forces me to take the time to put my own thoughts in place, so which really drive, how I think about my work as well. So certainly on the writing side, that's critically important. The filmmaking is a little bit different. And there's a bit of a story around that. I was at dinner one night at a wedding and sitting next to someone who I consider, an elder statesman compared to me. And he was telling me about some of the things of his career. And I was like, this is fascinating, things that I never knew. And I thought I knew all about, I write books, I know all about telecom. And I'm like, I didn't know this history. So I actually set out to write an oral history of kind of how competition came in telecom, because that's one of my big issues that I really personally care about. And it turns out I am not able to write an oral biography. I'm not William Kennedy. And so I said, I know I have to make this into a film, because the people who I wanted to talk to, Vince Cerf, for instance, who was one of the founders of the internet, is a very colorful man. Others, you lose that on the page. But I didn't know how to make a documentary, even though I had a theater degree, wanted to be a filmmaker. And so I actually started with kind of a baby step, which is my husband's a scientist, and he works on a model organism called a zebrafish, which is fantastic for scientific research. It breeds quite frequently, it's cheap, it's easy to care for, and it has all the same organs as people, most importantly, as well as the embryo being developed outside the womb and being transparent. And we had always talked about, wouldn't it be fun to get messages out about this? So I woke up one morning and said, I know I'm going to make a short documentary about zebrafish. And so I figured out how it gave me the ability to do what I wanted to do, which is make the film I'm filming now. But I learned so much. And it opened my eyes to this whole other world. I learned how I needed to get production companies and writers, and putting it together, which has now enabled me to do my film When Wire Was King, the transformation of telecommunications, which is my passion project. And for me, it's been so rewarding because I've gotten to interview people who are just fascinating, whether it's Vince Cerf, who invented the internet, literally, Brian Lamb, who founded C-SPAN, which is one of our major public interest cable channels, folks who served in previous White Houses, just legends in their own right, and learning that and putting it together. So, but having that separate side of what I do, I think makes me, I guess, more whole, because it's not just my day-to-day work, but I have this other work. We also do other things. I'm a big runner. I swim every day. But I think people need to have a lot of things. I mean, even when you have children, I think it's important. It's not as easy to find this amount of time but to have some period where you can do something that's different that you enjoy and that challenges you. And I think I've also been lucky because I've truly enjoyed my career. So I'm usually fairly happy with work. And then I have these add-on things that I enjoy. And they get frustrating too. Not everything works. We filmed during a pandemic when you couldn't get people together and you had to figure out how do you do interviews at a film quality. Zoom's not quite the same quality you want in a TV show. So it's good. It gives you different challenges, which I think helps you with your career and just makes you a happier, more wholesome person.
I agree. And I think it's really interesting that you work in so many different mediums, I guess you could say, with your writing, with your filmmaking. So for example, if somebody doesn't read or doesn't like reading books or just does not consume information that way, they can watch a documentary and learn that way, or or vice versa if somebody just does not like watching movies. So I think it's great that you can create these things and communicate your ideas to different people in different ways. So I guess I kind of want to talk about writing a little bit, because I think that writing is very important. It teaches you how to communicate your ideas, especially writing technically. And so can you talk a little bit about what role writing and reading as practices have played in your life through your career development, or maybe through your hobbies or work outside of work?
I agree with you. Writing, I think there's two things that are really necessary for success, even if you're coding, and that is being able to write and being able to speak. And both of those are very scary when you're early in your career. And it's scary for even the best writers and best speakers. So I went to scholarship on playwriting. So I was already a fairly good writer, and I've always enjoyed writing. But no one can write as well as they can. And I'll never forget my second job after the FCC. I went to a law firm. And I had a boss who used to just, at that point, you still did your edits by hand. I think we were still on Word. We weren't Word Perfect. I think we were using as a program. So he'd mark up and it would be all in red. And, I'd literally be crying. After I left that job, I realized what he was really doing was making me a better writer. And I talked to him years later, and I said, Tom, you used to almost make me cry on this stuff. He goes, it's only because I cared. He goes, if I didn't think you had the potential, I wouldn't have spent the time. And I kind of feel the same thing with my folks where, it's always that as a manager or as a mentor, you're always like, do I upset people more? But at the same point, you almost can't learn unless someone looks at it. And my view is, I'm fine with people editing my work. I edited it today, probably more extensively than I care, but usually it's to make it clearer. And the view being, that if someone can't read it, understand it when they're reading it, it probably doesn't make sense. So, I think one of the reasons people stumble on writing is that they'll get something back and someone will mark it all up, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. They're just helping you communicate more clearly. So I say any opportunity you have to write, you should. If it's doing a blog, it doesn't have to be, certainly journal papers are great, but they're very time consuming and people not. But just spending the time. And the other thing I think that's really important is at times putting things away when you can't figure out what to say and coming back to it. You could talk to your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your husband. I talk to my dog quite a bit when we go running. We talk through issues. Talk to your cat, your hamster. But going back and taking that time to kind of, when you do get stuck, to think it through. And usually you'll figure out the way forward, and it may not be perfect. And you may even want to ask someone else. I often ask someone to look at something that I'm not sure of. Can you figure this, or do you understand what I'm saying? So I think it's a really good opportunity. Similarly with speaking, I was a professor at Georgetown Law School for 15 years. And one of the requirements of my class was you got extra credit if you presented about we had a lot of international students, if you presented something about your own telecommunications industry or regulatory issues in your country. And it was really to get people the chance to speak, and there are ways to do this. I have friends, there's a group called Toastmasters, which is fairly international. You could join a group like that. But even speaking, in a meeting, asking your boss if you can present something or a portion of what's being presented, getting that experience. And once again, you're not going to be perfect. You're not going to always speak so clearly, but over time you'll get it. And you know what, if you make a mistake, it's okay. Life will go on. No one's going to remember. They're going to be more excited that you tried and you put yourself out there.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to try even if you're unsure or if you're scared of the criticism, because, like you said, the criticism is there to make you better. Of course, if the criticism is coming not from a constructive place, it's okay to discard it, but constructive criticism is always a good thing to have. If you could go back in time and tell yourself a piece of advice, what piece of advice would that be?
I think it's to almost be more, to not underestimate myself. If I looked at myself, 30 or so years ago, I was very nervous about misstepping. And I
Mhm.
didn't have the confidence I have today. I consider myself fairly self-confident, but not to doubt my own abilities and to just try. And that's a very hard thing to do because you're worried, how do I look? How do I sound? Am I doing this right? But not to worry so much and more take the initiative and be a little more confident around others. I always used to apologize a lot for things. If something wasn't right, I'd be like, I'm sorry, it wasn't that it was my fault. But trying to move away from that and really recognize my own self-worth would be something. And I think it's a problem I do see. I don't think I'm the only person who's when they're young who has that, who faces that dilemma.
A lot of women I know who have tech careers, or not just tech careers, a lot of young women I know in general have imposter syndrome, or have the same things that you're talking about that you experienced when you were younger. I think it's a phenomenon that permeates through.
And I agree. I think it's more women than men,
Yeah.
or maybe men just don't show it as much. But when I'm talking to my girlfriends and we're making a decision on something we'll do, we're like, well, what would a man do? We'll be like we're going to apply for a new job and we're like, we don't really have this qualification. And I'm like, okay, if you were a man, would you apply? Yes. So go apply.
Mhm.
And so even
Yeah.
today, 30 some odd years later, it's still an issue.
Yeah. What's the saying? You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Just keep trying, even if you think you might not get it. So, I mean, this is a series that's directed towards young women in tech. So, do you have any other advice that you'd want to share with young women or not so young women in tech? Anybody, really?
Yeah, and I think one of the areas that I'm very active in is I have the honor to be one of the co-chairs of the network of women at the International Telecommunications Radio Communications Center. And we've been having these mentorship programs now in the ITUR since 2015, so for 6 years now. I think the programs become much more formalized, but one of the things I really am enjoying this time is that my mentees have gone out of their way to really think about where do they need advice and
Mhm.
what questions do they want answered that maybe they don't feel on work stuff. I mean, they can do it on personal too. I'm happy to help, share my insights on what I've learned just through life. But there's a woman I'm working with, and she presented a paper, a very solid technical paper. She's a very, very confident young woman, and she knows she did a good paper, and it was, but she got lots of pushback, and she wanted to understand why. And the fact that we're walking through, well, here's the politics, here's this. What can she do procedurally the next time to better advance herself? I never ask those questions, or rarely, but I think going and finding someone you can ask those questions when you don't feel like you can ask your boss because you don't want to look like you don't know what you're doing. I mean, there is an appearance issue. I'm not going to say you can ask anyone anything because I actually don't think that's always the case. But finding these people who can answer questions on how are you going to be successful, what do I do? How do I move here or there? And I think that will better equip, especially for younger people in tech. Well, when I joined, it was primarily made up of old white men. And today it's still primarily made up of old white men with a few older white women now. I think there's such room for young people. I think this is the
Mhm.
good news is we want young people. And, I love it when someone asks me for help and says, I want to be a leader, I want to do this, or I just want to do my job well. It doesn't always have to be about, becoming head of a committee or, chairing something. Sometimes it's just, I want to do a good job and get a raise, or I just want to do a good job, make my boss happy and make me feel good. But doing that is great because I think everyone wants you to succeed. And, I think that's the other thing I didn't realize when I was young, going back to what advice is that people do want to help you in your career, especially people who are maybe not everyone who's at your level who you're competing against. It's a different story, but certainly the people ahead of you want you to be successful. You're a future.
That's great to hear. There is that structure of support. If you go looking for it, that it exists. You just have to try to look for it, and you'll find somebody to answer your questions if you just keep looking for the right person. All right. I think that wraps up our session today for Talking Tech, Women and Girls in ICT. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I really enjoyed our chat today. And thank you so much to anybody who's watching. I hope you learned something. I know I did. Thank you.
Thank you.